This is the Do-It-Yourself Guide to Business Buying. Today we're talking about the letter of intent. Welcome, business buyers. Today we're going to be discussing legal provisions, and what we cover may not be an exact fit for your situation. So if you need legal advice, don't rely on videos, this one or any other video. Get your advice from a lawyer. I have counsel review my LOI template and the language I use, especially on legally binding provisions. Then I will typically write up the LOI myself. That doesn't mean you should take the same approach. Discuss it with your lawyer. Bottom line, nothing in this video constitutes legal advice. We're talking about general legal principles and legal issues. We aren't providing advice. What is the goal with this video letter of intent? Well, number one, it's to describe how the LOI fits into the business buying cycle. And number two, explain the provisions that we typically include in an LOI and why. Now, sample LOIs are available on our DIY business buying site. Grab one, maybe even have it beside you while you're watching this video. But let's get started. What is the purpose of an LOI? It's to summarize the business agreement between buyer and seller and give directions to the lawyer who's going to draft that buy-sell agreement. Now, where does the LOI fit into the overall business buying cycle? We've taken a look at that in previous videos, where we went from finding the deal to closing the deal. Initially, deal flow, discovery, seller meeting, negotiations ends in us submitting a detailed offer. From there, we move to the letter of intent. And from there, we draft a buy-sell agreement, get it signed, and we close our deal. So of the three, the one we're focusing on today, of course, is the letter of intent. It's a pretty important milestone. There's a definite before to it and an after. And of course, in this video, we're focusing on the after. And if the LOI is an important milestone, what happens after the LOI is signed? Well, number one, that's when we're going to engage the lawyer to draft that purchase agreement or buy-sell agreement. We don't do it before. The LOI captures the agreement, and now the lawyer formalizes it into a legal agreement. We're going to begin our formal due diligence review. We've done some preliminary DD in discovery. Now we're getting into the heavy-duty formal due diligence. Number three, we're going to secure financing from lenders and or investors for the closing payment. We did mention that some sellers won't sign an LOI until they have a term sheet. So for those folks, we had to start early. Everybody else, we get started on the financing. Number four, we got to find someone to run the business, find a GM, and negotiate an employment agreement with them. Number five, we've got to plan a visit to the target business, especially haven't been there yet. Number six, begin finalizing the handover plan with the seller, the transition. What kind of time do we need from the seller? How long do we want them to be committed? Next, we have to review assignment of third-party legal agreements, like leasing the facility, leasing equipment, etc. And finally, we have to start developing an employee retention plan. More important in an asset purchase than a share purchase, but still important in both. These are things that we don't typically do before the LOI is signed. It's an important milestone. It really says we've got an agreement on all the fundamental terms. So now we can free up some time and effort to move this thing forward. Now, a letter of intent is really just a bunch of legal provisions. Some of them are legally binding. Some of them are not legally binding. What's the difference? I think about it this way. Legally binding provisions are ones that aren't subject to change after due diligence is completed. That's not true for the non-legally binding. Let me give you an example. We do the due diligence. We might come back and think, you know what, I'm not going to pay that much for this particular business that I put in my offer, right? There's some big red flags. So I might want to adjust the purchase price. I might want to increase the earnout. I might want to change the seller note. So non-legally binding provisions are typically ones where, hey, if we're not getting what we thought we were going to get, we're going to change some of these provisions. But now go over to the left to the legally binding ones. How are they different? Because it doesn't really matter what we find in due diligence, right? We're still going to be legally bound to that provision. Something like confidentiality. Due diligence doesn't have an impact in terms of whether they're still going to be in play or not. Now, recitals are neither. There's a couple of them. We're going to get to them in a minute. But if we have legally binding and non-legally binding provisions, I'm going to cover 7 legally binding provisions and 20 non-legally binding provisions. Okay, let's get started with the legally binding provisions. We already mentioned confidentiality. I mean, both parties are going to be bound by that. Have to maintain confidentiality of proprietary information that was learned during discovery, in negotiations, and in the due diligence review. Now, we already signed an NDA promising confidentiality, but it is also typically included in the LOI as well. The next legally binding provision is exclusivity. It's going to specify the seller can't solicit offers or engage with other buyers for some predetermined period of time. Now, in SMB deals, the exclusivity period is often between 45 to 90 days, depending on how it's funded. The more external funding we need, the longer we want the exclusivity period. If there is no external funding, then exclusivity of 45 days, might be plenty. Number 3, the governing law. Which laws will govern the interpretation or enforcement of the LOI? We're identifying the legal system where disputes occurring during the LOI phase will be resolved. And so typically we're going to have governing law in there as well. Whenever you have legally binding provisions, you need governing law. Number 4, breakup fees. I always like to put them in. They require the seller to pay a breakup fee if the deal doesn't go through under certain conditions. Kind of works as an incentive for the seller not to just arbitrarily walk away. It compels them to act in good faith. It's often a flat fee. Can be a bit of a tough sell with some sellers, but I definitely am going to put it into my LOI and negotiate it. Occasionally I have to take it out because I can't get it through, but plenty of times there is at least some breakup fee in there, which helps cover legal costs if the seller gets cold feet and walks away late in the game. Number 5, dispute resolution. This is where we outline the agreed upon method for resolving disputes that are related to the LOI that we're signing. I only occasionally find this in SMB type deals. For example, if an earnest money deposit is part of the deal and there's an escrow agreement, then we do need dispute resolution in there as well. I don't like EMDs. I don't recommend them. We'll go into the earnest money deposit in a separate video later on. Number 6, indemnification. We indemnify one party for specified costs or losses caused by the other. This is by no means universal, but in some deals, indemnification is needed. It's part of risk allocation in the buy-sell agreement, and so sometimes you will see indemnification in there. Termination is sometimes in there as well, which outlines the conditions where the LOI can be terminated by either party, but specifies the conditions where people can walk away without triggering that breakup fee. So that's the 7. These are legally binding provisions. The first 3, confidentiality, exclusivity, and governing law, I'm going to put in every single LOI that I write. I include a breakup fee. Do I always get it in there? No, but I always start with that. And the other 3, dispute resolution, indemnification, termination, are more specialized and only really are necessary in certain kinds of deals. Let's get into the non-legally binding provisions. The first one is the LOI is non-legally binding. We have to clearly state that the provisions listed are not binding on the buyer and seller and are subject to due diligence, excluding, of course, the exceptions that are legally binding that we just discussed, confidentiality, governing law, etc. We want to ensure that the LOI itself does not become an enforceable legal contract. And there is some legal precedent where that has actually happened. So we want to put the right language in there and specifically address the issue of the LOI being non-legally binding. Number 2, it's kind of like a recital that you'd find in a contract that just identifies the buyer and the seller entities, including parent companies or subsidiaries directly involved. It includes shareholder names of each different entity that's involved in the sale. And you may need more than one LOI if you have 2 or 3 companies that you're buying as part of the acquisition, and all of them have different ownership groups. But that's kind of like play it by ear. Number 3, the business description, again, like a recital. We give a brief overview of the business being acquired, including its industry, operations, and key assets. And make sure you include a separate description for each separate entity that's involved in the transaction, just so everybody's crystal clear. Number 4, asset versus share purchase. Indicate whether the transaction is an asset purchase or a share purchase. It makes a difference. And if it's a share purchase, don't forget to include the percentage of the shares that are being acquired. Might be 100%, but specifically address that issue. There's a lot to shares versus assets, and I've got a separate video that goes into a lot of detail. Number 5, the purchase price. List the total amount the buyer intends to pay for the business. And of course, if an earnout is part of the deal, that's got to include the maximum contingent amount that the buyer is willing to pay over the length of the earnout. Number 6, the closing payment. List how much of the purchase price will be paid on the closing date. Don't forget to include the means of payment, which is typically a wire transfer. So people want to know, what am I getting on day 1? What am I getting on the closing day? Number 7, the amount of the seller note. If part of the purchase price is being financed by the seller, vendor financing, or a seller note, list the total amount. Indicate that the amount owing is a fixed amount if there is no earnout in the structure. Earnouts are conditional consideration. Without an earnout, it's fixed consideration. Number 8, the seller note terms. Make sure you list the terms of the seller note, including interest rate, repayment schedule, and duration. I don't typically include default provisions of the seller note in the letter of intent. I wait and cover them in more detail in the buy-sell agreement. Number 9, seller note security. Mention security features like share clawback, company guarantees, restrictive loan covenants, etc. Whatever you have in your security package, it's very important to the seller. If you plan to finance a large chunk of the deal through vendor financing, they want to know what kind of security they're going to have. But describe it at a high level only. I would leave the details for the buy-sell agreement. Number 10, earnout amount. If applicable, specify that payments made will be partly based upon the business's future performance. And of course, you have to describe the mechanics of the yearly payments when it comes to earnouts, the metric that's used to trigger the earnout, the trigger amount, the yearly maximum, etc. If there's an earnout, make sure it's clearly explained. Number 11, financial debt transferred. List the financial debt that makes up part of the purchase price, itemized with name and amount if you are going to inherit financial debt. Financial debt is borrowed money with principal balance owing and interest paid. It doesn't include things like unpaid bills. If you buy materials, you haven't paid for them yet, you have an accounts payable. That's not financial debt. Number 12, resolving shareholder loans. Stipulate that all shareholder loans should be resolved prior to the closing date of the transaction. Sometimes it's on the debit side, the shareholder loan. What does that mean? It means the individual or the owner owes the business money because the business has lent the owner money. On the credit side, it's the other way around. It means the shareholder has lent the business money and the business owes the shareholder money. Whether it's a debit or a credit makes no difference. We don't want to close with shareholder loans on the books, so we ask them to resolve it beforehand. Resolution could mean repayment, conversion into equity, or any other mutually agreed upon terms. Number 13, pegging working capital. We want to establish the target level of working capital that the business is expected to have on the closing date. And then adjustments to the purchase price can be made depending upon the actual working capital at closing and how it compares to the pegged working capital. If actual working capital is above the peg value, that means the buyer owes the seller the difference. If it's the other way around, if the actual closing working capital is less than the peg value, that means the seller owes the buyer the difference. Number 14, a price adjustment clause. Usually the LOI will include a price adjustment clause that describes how the purchase price may be adjusted based upon certain predefined criteria. Mention the criteria: changes in asset value, changes in financial performance, changes in working capital between the LOI date and the closing date. Very common to have this provision. Number 15, the right to due diligence. Explain that the buyer has the right to conduct a thorough investigation of the target business. Mention financial, legal, commercial, and operational due diligence, all related to the business. Put it right in the LOI. 16, timelines and milestones. Outline a tentative timeline for the major elements of the transaction. Include due diligence, negotiation of the final agreement, and tentative closing date. Put it in there. 17, mention your intention to include a non-compete clause in the final agreement for the current owners. Explain how it will restrict the sellers from competing in a similar business for a specified period in a given location. I don't typically get into too many details on the non-compete in the LOI, but I will mention the intent for the final agreement to have non-compete clauses in it. 18, pre-closing obligations. Outline any actions or conditions that must be met by either party before closing. One common inclusion, for example, is that the seller has to maintain normal business operations from the LOI date to the closing date. We don't want the wheels falling off the wagon or the business being driven off a cliff, so we'll put that in there. Number 19, post-closing commitments. Mention any agreements on post-closing activities or conditions that must be put in place. For example, maybe transitional assistance is required, or regulatory compliance, or maybe employment agreements or other things. And finally, mention the intent to have a future definitive agreement. Explain the mutual intention of both parties to draft and execute a definitive purchase agreement, based upon, of course, the provisions included in the letter of intent and any post-due diligence adjustments. Some final thoughts on the LOI before we wrap up. The more detailed the LOI, the less the closing risk. What do I mean? Let's go back to our business buying cycle. We find a deal and we're working through. We have detailed offer, letter of intent, and buy-sell agreement. And the farther out you can move the letter of intent and the more details that are included and finalized in the letter of intent, the less negotiating you have to do with opposing counsel, and the better off you're going to be. Let's talk about how we want transactions to work, and then we'll compare them to how they often work. We start with buyers and sellers negotiating an agreement. Then the buyer and seller sign an LOI, the lawyer drafts the buy-sell agreement, and the buyer and the seller sign the buy-sell agreement. That's the way we want it to work. And then, of course, the deal closes. But here's how the transaction often ends up working. Yes, the buyer and seller negotiate the agreement, they sign the LOI, the buyer lawyer drafts the buy sell agreement, but then boom, it comes to a hard stop. Why? Because the opposing lawyer wants to start renegotiating the LOI from scratch on terms much more favorable to the seller. I've seen this scenario played out so many times. It's very common, and we need an effective defense against it. Opposing lawyer involvement has to be really carefully considered. If they get involved too early, things can get adversarial quickly, hard to come to an agreement. But if you leave it too late, then the lawyer feels ambushed and we get to push back pretty hard on what we're trying to accomplish. So really, in a way, it has to be finessed. I pay attention to the opposing lawyer posture, where they're coming from. Many lawyers just want to drive their client risk to zero. That's it. Push all the risk over to the buyer. Others are more reasonable. They're trying to get their client the best deal possible that is fair. Those are the kinds of lawyers we love. One's in the first category. You know what? I've never encountered one yet that didn't want to renegotiate the LOI. So we need to be prepared to ward off lawyer-inspired LOI renegotiations. It can really get us into a quagmire, right? So there's ways that we can do it. We do have to finesse the situation. We have to basically collaborate with the seller. So it's buyer and seller against lawyers on both sides. I've successfully managed to do that in a few transactions that really work well. We just tell them, if we leave this to the lawyers, because they're looking out for our best interest and because they tend to be adversarial, it can sometimes be hard to get a deal done. So let's get the lawyers to take the agreement that we've reached and legally paper it so that we can translate our economic agreement into a legal agreement. Let's limit their role to that particular function. And if we can, we're going to have a lot of success. And with the LOI signed, we are getting close, but still lots more to do, which means in the next video, we're going to jump into due diligence. Hey, let's get after it. This is the Do-It-Yourself Guide to Business Buying. Today, we've been talking about the letter of intent because we want to learn and grow as we go. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.